Tonight, drift back 250 million years to a planet so damaged it barely functioned, and to the lineage that rose from that damage to rule the Earth for 165 million years. This is the full story of the dinosaurs, how they began in the wreckage of one extinction, survived another, filled every corner of the world, and ended on a single morning when the sky changed. 250 million years ago, the Earth was a single landmass, not the familiar arrangement of separated continents with their blue borders of ocean between them, but one unbroken piece of land stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a single vast sea. Geologists call it Pangaea. Its interior was a desert of almost incomprehensible scale, red rock and gravel flats extending for thousands of miles in every direction, with no moisture reaching far enough inland to support anything more than the hardiest scrub. Life existed on Pangaea, but it existed at the edges, clinging to coastlines and river deltas where the ocean's moisture could still reach. The forests that grew there bore no resemblance to anything alive today. No flowering plants, no grasses, no broadleaf trees. Seed ferns spread their fronds above cycads and primitive conifers, and through these strange forests moved the dominant animals of the Permian, the synapsids, a lineage of mammal-like reptiles that had ruled the land for tens of millions of years. Some were small and dog-like, scavenging through the undergrowth. Others were enormous, tusked, grazing across coastal floodplains in numbers that would not be matched again for a very long time. The synapsids had the world arranged to their advantage. Then the volcanoes began. The Siberian Traps, a volcanic system centered in what is now northern Russia, started erupting in a sustained, catastrophic outpouring of lava and gas that would continue for roughly 2 million years. Not explosive eruptions in the way we picture volcanoes, but flood basalt events, vast sheets of lava pouring across the landscape, releasing gases into the atmosphere in quantities that had no precedent in the history of complex life. What the eruptions released had no parallel. Nothing alive had ever encountered atmospheric chemistry shifting at this speed, at this scale, with this much sustained pressure behind it. The world that had supported the synapsids for tens of millions of years was being chemically disassembled beneath them. But the eruptions didn't kill everything at once. That is what makes the Great Dying so difficult to understand from a human perspective. There was no single catastrophic day, no moment when the sky went dark and the world ended in an afternoon. The dying was slow, sustained, and cumulative, a pressure that built across hundreds of thousands of years, pushing ecosystems past one threshold, then another, each collapse making the next one easier to trigger. Marine ecosystems began failing first. The chemistry of the ocean shifted faster than the organisms living in it could adapt, and species that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years simply stopped producing viable offspring. On land, the changes came through the food web rather than directly through the atmosphere. Plants stressed by heat and drought produced less foliage. Herbivores that depended on that foliage declined. Predators that depended on those herbivores followed. The collapse moved upward through the chain, one link at a time, until entire ecosystems that had been stable for tens of millions of years simply stopped functioning. But the synapsids, the dominant land animals of the Permian, the lineage that had every apparent advantage, were hit hardest of all. Some groups lost more than 90% of their species. The Dicynodonts, the Gorgonopsids, the large herbivores and predators that had made the Permian world what it was, were reduced to remnant populations or erased entirely. What the extinction was selecting for had nothing to do with the qualities that had made any of these animals dominant. The pressure being applied was so unlike anything the preceding tens of millions of years had produced that the traits rewarded by the old world became liabilities in the new one. And the traits that would determine survival were ones the Permian's ruling lineages had never needed to develop. The answer is not that life recovered quickly. It didn't. For roughly 5 million years after the Permian extinction, the planet remained a hostile, oxygen-depleted, acidic place where most complex ecosystems couldn't rebuild. The Siberian traps had done something subtler and more lasting than simply killing things. They had broken the feedback loops that keep ecosystems stable, the nutrient cycling, the predator-prey ratios, the soil chemistry, and those loops took millions of years to reassemble. Coral reefs didn't recover for 8 to 10 million years. What came back wasn't the old world with new labels. It was something structurally different, populated by survivors who had endured through flexibility rather than dominance. The creatures that made it through the Great Dying weren't the strongest ones. They were the ones whose biology could tolerate extremes: low oxygen, unpredictable food, temperature swings that would have killed the old rulers outright. That selective pressure is why what emerged on the other side looked so different. The Permian's dominant synapsids, the mammal-like ruling reptiles, had been devastated. The archosaurs, smaller and less established before the extinction, now had open terrain. Every niche that had been locked down for millions of years was suddenly vacant. That vacancy is the origin of every dinosaur that ever lived. Without the Great Dying erasing 96% of marine species and 70% of land vertebrates, the Triassic world would have remained crowded with incumbents. There would have been no room for the experiments that followed. If this is the kind of story you want more of, deep time, quiet narration, ancient worlds reconstructed in the dark, subscribing takes one tap and means the next one finds you automatically. But the world the synapsids had ruled was gone, and something had to fill what it left behind. The survivors of the Great Dying were inheriting a planet that barely functioned. Broken food webs, unstable climate, soils that could barely hold a root system together. What came next wasn't a recovery so much as a renegotiation, and the animal that would eventually win that negotiation carried its advantage not in its teeth or its size, but somewhere less obvious and harder to measure. The question is what that advantage actually was, and why nothing that had survived the extinction could match it. The world that existed after the Great Dying was not simply depleted, it was structurally broken. The food webs that had sustained complex ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years had collapsed from the bottom up. The plankton, the small invertebrates, the plants that anchored every chain of predator and prey. What remained was a patchwork of survivors in a landscape that could barely support them, scattered across a planet still geologically unstable and climatically erratic. The Triassic period opened on this wreckage. Temperatures swung between extremes. Monsoon cycles lashed Pangaea's coastlines with flooding rains, then left the interior baking in drought for months. The first forests to return were scrappy and sparse, pioneering conifers and seed ferns pushing back into soils still recovering their fertility, rooting into ground that had been bare rock only a few 100,000 years before. Into this uncertain world, the survivors spread and began, slowly, to diversify. Among those survivors was a group of reptiles that had been relatively marginal before the extinction, the archosaurs. In the Permian, they had occupied a modest range of ecological roles, not yet numerous enough or specialized enough to compete seriously with the dominant synapsid lineages. But the extinction had removed those dominant lineages. The archosaurs now had space, and they had something in their bodies that would matter enormously in the world the Triassic was building. Something structural. Something that had nothing to do with size or aggression or speed, but that would determine, over the following tens of millions of years, which lineages could sustain themselves and which ones couldn't. The synapsids had ruled through strength. What was coming would be decided by something quieter than that. But having space is not the same as knowing what to do with it. The early Triassic world presented its survivors with a problem that had no precedent, an enormous amount of ecological vacancy and almost no stability in which to fill it. The climate was still erratic. The soil systems that underpin terrestrial food webs were still rebuilding their fertility. A lineage could establish itself in a niche, expand for a few 100,000 years, and then be knocked back by a drought cycle or a shift in monsoon patterns that eliminated the food base it had just learned to exploit. The fossil record of the early Triassic shows this instability clearly. A series of false starts, lineages expanding and then contracting, ecological communities forming and then reorganizing under the pressure of continued environmental volatility. Recovery was not a straight line. It was an irregular, lurching process that kept resetting itself before anything could fully consolidate. But the archosaur lineage kept expanding anyway, and through the Middle Triassic, its different branches were pulling in opposite directions. One branch was becoming more crocodile-like, lower to the ground, armored, adapted to a semi-aquatic existence at the edges of rivers and lakes. Another branch was becoming more upright, faster, more dependent on sustained terrestrial activity, shaped by something in its body plan that gave it a measurable advantage in the conditions the Triassic world kept imposing. But in the Middle Triassic, that branch was still a minor part of a world dominated by other archosaur lineages, particularly the Rauisuchians, large, active, quadrupedal predators that occupied the top carnivore roles across much of Pangaea and showed no signs of yielding them. The archosaurs had the advantage. Whether any particular archosaur group would translate that advantage into lasting dominance was still entirely unresolved. The archosaurs won the Triassic not by being more aggressive or more intelligent, but by solving a mechanical problem that their competitors hadn't. A sprawling stance, legs out to the side, belly close to the ground, forces the ribcage to compress on the side bearing the animal's weight during each stride, which means an animal with a sprawling gait can't breathe efficiently while running at full speed. Archosaurs, with their legs tucked directly beneath their bodies, didn't have this constraint. Their breathing and their movement were decoupled. That meant they could sustain activity over longer distances, recover faster after exertion, and pursue prey without an oxygen debt accumulating in the first few seconds of the chase. This single anatomical shift gave them an endurance advantage that compounded across millions of years of competition. The early dinosaurs emerging from this archosaur lineage were small, most under a meter long, some no bigger than a house cat, and they were not yet the dominant animals in their ecosystems. Dicynodonts, tusked plant eaters the size of cows, still grazed in enormous numbers. Armored etosaurs still occupied the herbivore niches across Pangaea's drier interior. Rauisuchians, large four-legged archosaurs with serrated teeth, were the top predators. Dinosaurs fit between all of these, fast and adaptable, feeding on insects and small prey, filling whatever gaps those larger animals left open. The Triassic world gave dinosaurs a foothold, not a throne. They had the physiology to compete. They didn't yet have the world to themselves. But the archosaurs had not yet produced anything that looked like a ruler. The early dinosaurs emerging from that lineage were small, marginal, and surrounded on every side by animals better established than they were. For tens of millions of years, the Triassic world kept the contest open, no single lineage pulling far enough ahead to close it. What broke that stalemate was not evolution. It was geology, and it came without warning. The early dinosaurs of the Triassic were not impressive animals by any obvious measure. Most were small, some no heavier than a large chicken, and they shared their world with competitors that dwarfed them. Dicynodonts, the tusked plant eaters that had survived the Permian extinction, still roamed Pangaea's landscapes in enormous numbers, some species reaching the size of cattle. Rauisuchians, large, four-legged archosaurs with serrated teeth, held the top predator roles across much of the supercontinent. The Aetors, armored and stocky, occupied the middle herbivore niches. Against this competition, early dinosaurs occupied a position that could charitably be described as modest. They were fast and they were adaptable, but the ecological landscape was crowded, and the crowding kept any single lineage from pulling too far ahead. The Triassic world was, for most of its duration, a contest with no clear winner. What changed the outcome was not something the dinosaurs did, it was something the Earth did. Pangaea had been stable as a single landmass for hundreds of millions of years, but by the late Triassic, the stresses building along its internal fault lines were becoming unsustainable. The supercontinent was beginning to pull apart, rifting along zones that would eventually become the Atlantic Ocean. Somewhere around 201 million years ago, the world went through another extinction event, less catastrophic than the Great Dying in absolute terms, but lethal enough to eliminate roughly half of all species on Earth. The Triassic-Jurassic boundary is one of the sharpest lines in the fossil record. But the extinction that cleared the Triassic didn't distribute its effects evenly. Some regions lost more than others. Some ecological communities were nearly erased, while neighboring communities survived with less damage, for reasons the fossil record hasn't fully explained. The extinction was severe enough to eliminate the main competitors to dinosaur dominance, but not so total as to create a completely open world. What remained was a patchwork of surviving lineages, each still occupying whatever ecological ground it had managed to hold, each still capable of competing with the dinosaurs, now radiating into adjacent niches. The early Jurassic was not a world handed to dinosaurs on open ground. It was a world where dinosaurs had to earn their positions against whatever had survived alongside them, in an environment that was itself still unstable and prone to local disruptions. But the dinosaurs that had survived into the early Jurassic were not the same animals that had existed in the Triassic margins. The extinction had filtered them too, eliminating the most specialized and vulnerable early forms while leaving the lineages whose biology was flexible enough to move into whatever ecological space the new world offered. What came through carried the potential for an extraordinary range of body plans and ecological roles, none of which were yet expressed, none of which were guaranteed, and all of which depended on conditions remaining stable enough for diversification to compound rather than reset. The early Jurassic world was still capable of reversing whatever gains the dinosaurs had made, and the forces that would eventually secure their dominance had not yet fully assembled. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, roughly 201 million years ago, killed approximately 50% of species on Earth. What triggered it is still debated. The leading candidate is the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a massive volcanic system that erupted as Pangaea began tearing apart, releasing carbon dioxide on a scale comparable to the Siberian traps. But the outcome is unambiguous. The animals that had been competing with dinosaurs for dominance across the Triassic largely disappeared. The Dicynodonts were gone. The large Rauisuchians were gone. The Atasaurs were gone. Dinosaurs survived in numbers significant enough to radiate into the empty niches left behind, spreading across nearly every large landmass on Earth within a few million years, and filling roles from small insect hunters to the first large herbivores. Pangaea's fracturing accelerated this. As the supercontinent split along rift zones, new coastlines formed, humidity penetrated further inland, and forests expanded into regions that had been too dry to support dense vegetation. The habitats multiplied. Dinosaur populations, already spreading, were now being divided into isolated pockets on separating landmasses, each pocket evolving independently under local pressures. This is the mechanism behind the remarkable diversity of early Jurassic dinosaur fossils. Similar body plans appearing on different continents, shaped differently by different environments, already beginning the long divergence that would eventually produce the full range of what we recognize as the dinosaur family. The world had cleared. Dinosaurs were the only large animals left to fill what it offered. But claiming the stage and filling it are two different things. The early Jurassic dinosaurs had inherited a world with fewer competitors than any dinosaur lineage had ever faced, and a planet growing wetter and more productive than at any point since the Triassic began. What they built inside that window, the body plans, the ecological roles, the sheer physical scale, had no precedent in the history of land animals. The question is how any living system gets to 70 tons and still keeps functioning. The early Jurassic world was a world in the process of coming apart at the seams. Pangaea's fracturing had not yet produced the separate continents we recognize today. But the rifting had progressed far enough to open new seaways along the continental margins, to flood low-lying coastal regions, and to fundamentally change the moisture patterns across the landmass. Where the Triassic interior had been dry almost to the point of sterility, the Jurassic world was wetter, greener, and more varied in its habitats. Forests of conifers and tree ferns spread across regions that had previously been too arid to support them. Ferns carpeted the forest floor, rivers ran fuller and more consistently. The planet was rebuilding its productivity, and the dinosaurs, now free of the competitors that had constrained them through the Triassic, were beginning to fill the ecological space this productivity offered. What they became in the Jurassic was something the planet had never produced before and has not produced since. The sauropods, the long-necked, quadrupedal herbivores, whose silhouette has become the most iconic image of the dinosaur era, began their ascent toward body sizes that seem, by any reasonable standard, impossible for a land animal. The titanosaurs, the brachiosaurids, the diplodocids, these were not simply large animals. Some species reached lengths of 30 meters and weights approaching 70 or 80 tons, moving across Jurassic landscapes in groups that left tracks still preserved in rock formations on multiple continents. The ground shook under them. The trees they fed on had to be stripped from heights no other land animal could reach. And they were not alone. Predators of proportionate scale evolved to share their world, and the skies above and the seas around were filling with their own extraordinary occupants. But size is a trap as much as it is an advantage. An animal that weighs 70 tons requires a continuous, enormous input of calories simply to maintain itself, not to grow, not to reproduce, just to survive another day. A sauropod moving through a Jurassic forest was burning energy at a rate that no modern land animal approaches, and that energy had to come from somewhere constant and reliable. When the vegetation was abundant, this was manageable, but Jurassic World, for all its productivity, was not uniformly stable. Drought cycles still struck, seasons still varied. The vast forests that fed the sauropod herds were not evenly distributed across the landscape, and sauropods had to move, sometimes enormous distances, to stay within reach of sufficient food. Fossil evidence suggests sauropod herds engaged in seasonal migrations on a scale comparable to the great mammal migrations of the modern world, a logistical demand that, for an animal weighing tens of tons, was staggering. But the predators had their own pressures. Most of the sauropod population was simply beyond reach, not because Allosaurus lacked the capacity for violence, but because the physical realities of attacking an animal of that mass made most encounters more dangerous to the predator than to the prey. Allosaurus had to be selective in ways that constrained its options severely, focusing its attention on the fraction of the population whose circumstances made them accessible, while leaving the rest of the herd effectively untouchable. The predator-prey relationship in the Jurassic was therefore not a straightforward contest of hunter against hunted. It was a more constrained and specific ecological negotiation in which the predator's capabilities were perpetually tested against the prey's defenses, and in which getting it wrong for either side meant death. The question of how an animal reaches 70 or 80 tons and still functions as a living system has a specific answer. And it isn't simply that the Jurassic was more abundant or that the food supply was limitless. Sauropods solved a series of engineering problems simultaneously in ways no other land animal lineage has matched before or since. Their air sac system, a network of hollow spaces running through the vertebrae and into the bones themselves, made their skeleton lighter than the raw size would suggest, while also routing airflow through the lungs more efficiently than the mammalian breathing system allows. The same system runs through every bird alive today. A sauropod's lungs were extracting oxygen from each breath on both the inhale and the exhale, unlike mammalian lungs which extract oxygen primarily on the inhale. This meant their metabolism could support an enormous body without the respiratory system becoming a bottleneck. Their teeth, flat and peg-like in diplodocids, weren't designed for chewing. They stripped foliage off branches and swallowed it whole, letting a long digestive tract do the processing work that chewing would have done. This allowed sauropods to eat almost continuously while moving, covering vast distances and processing huge volumes of low-nutrition plant material. Predators like Allosaurus scaled upward in response. At 9 meters and over 2 tons, Allosaurus didn't overpower sauropods, but the Jurassic Empire wasn't confined to the land. Juvenile sauropods were solving the problem of size on the surface. Become separated from any group. Were running their own version of the same experiment of excess. Different animals. It was an era of precise biological engineering but the same evolutionary pressure to one problem towards specialization, a new ecological possibility. The marine world, the Jurassic built, was as structured and as lethal as anything on land, and the predators at its top were operating at the edge of what biology can sustain in water. What made them work, and what eventually made that world unsustainable, is a different kind of story. The Jurassic world was not confined to its land surfaces. As Pangaea pulled apart and seawater flooded the widening gaps between the separating land masses, the ocean geography of the planet was being transformed. New shallow seas formed along the continental margins, warm, sunlit, nutrient-rich environments that were among the most productive marine habitats the Earth had ever generated. These were not the deep, oxygen-depleted oceans that had persisted through much of the Triassic. They were layered, stratified, full of light in their upper reaches, and increasingly complex in their ecology as the Jurassic progressed. Coral reefs rebuilt themselves along the new coastlines. Ammonites, coiled, shelled relatives of squid and octopus, proliferated into thousands of distinct forms, filling every available niche in the water column and becoming so abundant that their shells now appear in Jurassic marine deposits on every continent. Where there is food in such quantities, predators follow. The marine reptiles that dominated Jurassic seas had deep roots. Ichthyosaurs had been present since the early Triassic, when the first experiments in aquatic reptile body plans produced forms that were still awkward and transitional. By the Jurassic, those transitional forms were long gone, replaced by animals that had been shaped by tens of millions of years of selection in open water until almost nothing of their terrestrial ancestry remained visible in their outline. Plesiosaurs had taken a different evolutionary path entirely, and the plesiosaurs a different one again, each shaped by the specific hunting demands of its layer of the water column, each arriving at solutions the others couldn't replicate. The Jurassic Sea was not one empire. It was several, stacked on top of each other. But the ocean is not a stable environment, and the Jurassic Sea was not without its disruptions. Shifts in ocean temperature changed the distribution of prey species, forcing marine predators to track those shifts or face starvation in waters that had previously been productive. Volcanic activity along the mid-ocean ridges, the same rifting process that was separating the continents on the surface, periodically released heat and mineral-rich water into the deep ocean, altering current patterns and affecting the chemistry of seawater in ways that cascaded upward through the food web. Local die-offs, zones of oxygen-depleted water spreading across sections of seafloor and driving everything above them toward the surface, created sudden concentrations of prey and predator in the shallower zones that must have produced scenes of extraordinary predatory intensity. The Jurassic Ocean was productive and lethal in equal measure. But the greatest pressure on the marine reptiles was one they couldn't defend against by speed or size or intelligence. It was the pressure of time itself, the slow accumulation of small changes in ocean chemistry and geography that, over millions of years, kept shifting the conditions their niches depended on. Ichthyosaurs had spent tens of millions of years perfecting a body plan for the Jurassic Ocean, but the Jurassic Ocean was not the ocean that would exist in the Cretaceous, and every million years of refinement for one set of conditions was a million years of reduced capacity to adapt when those conditions changed. The more precisely a lineage fits its environment, the more completely it depends on that environment remaining recognizable, and the Jurassic Ocean was already, slowly, becoming something else. Pangaea's breakup created new shallow coastlines, new continental shelves, new warm water habitats where sunlight could penetrate, and ecosystems could layer themselves from the surface down. Ichthyosaurs had been present since the Triassic, but by the Jurassic, they had converged on a body plan that modern dolphins would independently arrive at 130 million years later. Streamlined, fast. Warm water hunters with forward-facing eyes and lithe birth. Their convergence with dolphins isn't coincidence. It's the same physics, the same hydrodynamic constraints, producing the same solutions in different lineages across entirely different eras. The largest ichthyosaur eyes ever found measure over 26 centimeters in diameter, the largest known eyes in vertebrate history, and their size indicates exactly what these animals were doing. Hunting in deep water where light barely reached, where only an eye that large could gather enough photons to track a squid. Plesiosaurs and plesiosaurs occupied different niches in the same water column. Plesiosaurs sweeping the shallows with their long necks, plesiosaurs patrolling the mid-water and open ocean with speed and bone-crushing jaw force. Ammonites, found in every Jurassic marine deposit on Earth, were so numerous and evolved so rapidly that geologists use their distinct shell forms to date rock layers with precision, unavailable in most other fossil groups. When ichthyosaurs began declining at the end of the Jurassic, not extinct yet, but shrinking in diversity, it wasn't a failure of their design. It was competition from new predator lineages moving into their niche from below in the water column, combined with shifting ocean chemistry, creating pressures their design couldn't absorb. The ocean had a ceiling, even if it took millions of years to reach it. But the land and the sea were not the whole picture. For the first 100 million years of the dinosaur era, an entire dimension of the world remained out of reach, not because nothing had tried to claim it, but because the physics of getting a vertebrate body into sustained powered flight had resisted every attempt. One lineage solved it first. The solution they arrived at was unlike anything before it, and for 150 million years, no vertebrate came close to challenging them. What eventually changed that is a question about competition from a direction no established aerial animal could have anticipated. For the first 100 million years of dinosaur history, the sky above them remained entirely beyond their reach. The air was occupied. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than a human forearm had been present since the Carboniferous, and by the Triassic, the insect world had diversified into a complex aerial community, filling every layer of the atmosphere, from the forest floor to the canopy top. But no vertebrate had yet solved the problem of sustained powered flight. The physics were formidable. To lift a body heavier than an insect required a wing surface area, a musculature, and a skeletal architecture that nothing in the Triassic vertebrate lineage had yet produced. Gliding had been attempted. Some small lizard-like reptiles had evolved membranes between their ribs that allowed them to slow a fall. But gliding is not flying, and the distance between the two is measured in tens of millions of years of evolutionary work. The pterosaurs solved the problem first. They appear in the fossil record in the late Triassic without a clear transitional series leading up to them. The earliest pterosaur fossils already show fully formed wings, which means the evolutionary steps that produced powered flight in their lineage occurred in animals unlikely to have been preserved as fossils, probably small tree dwellers whose bones were too delicate and whose habitats too far from sediment-rich depositional environments to leave a record. What the fossils do show from the moment pterosaurs appear is an animal committed fully to the air. Their fourth finger was enormously elongated, longer than the rest of the limb, and a membrane of skin and muscle stretched from this finger along the body, forming a wing, unlike anything that had existed before. Early pterosaurs like Dimorphodon were probably clumsy by later standards, their large heads and relatively short wings making sustained flight energetically costly. But they were flying, and nothing else with a backbone was. But the sky is a demanding environment in ways that are easy to underestimate. Powered flight requires not just wings, but an entire suite of biological systems working in coordination. A metabolism capable of sustaining the muscular output that flight demands. A skeletal architecture light enough to be lifted by that output. A sensory system precise enough to navigate three-dimensional space at speed. And a respiratory system that can supply oxygen fast enough to keep all of it running. Any weakness in any of these systems and flight fails, usually catastrophically. The pterosaurs had solved every part of this problem, but the solution required constant maintenance. A wing membrane torn in a storm or by a predator's bite couldn't be regrown quickly. A bone fracture that would slow a land animal for a season could permanently ground a pterosaur and condemn it to starvation. The aerial lifestyle that gave pterosaurs access to resources unavailable to land animals came with a fragility that land animals didn't share. But as the Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous, something was changing in the theropod dinosaur lineage that pterosaurs had no evolutionary answer for. Small, fast, feathered theropods were beginning to exploit the aerial niche from below, not yet as efficient flyers, but as animals whose relationship with the air was becoming increasingly functional, increasingly competitive, and increasingly difficult for the established aerial occupants to ignore. They were present in the same forests and coastlines where small pterosaurs hunted, competing for the same prey, and closing the gap between gliding and flying in ways that left less and less unclaimed aerial space for the lineage that had previously occupied it alone. The pterosaurs had held the sky for 150 million years against no vertebrate competition. The competition, when it finally arrived, came from a direction no purely aerial animal could have anticipated. Pterosaurs held the sky for over 150 million years, longer than birds have existed. And the reason they could do this as reptiles comes down to the same biological innovations that made archosaurs competitive on land: hollow bones, air sacs, and a metabolism capable of sustaining powered flight. The pycnofibers covering their bodies provided insulation consistent with an endothermic animal, one that generated its own body heat rather than relying on the environment. A cold-blooded pterosaur couldn't have flown efficiently in the pre-dawn cold or hunted through overcast afternoons. The metabolic demand of powered flight requires continuous heat generation. Their skeletons were so pneumatized, so riddled with air-filled chambers connected to the respiratory system, that a pterosaur skull could be enormous in surface area while weighing almost nothing by volume. Quetzalcoatlus, the late Cretaceous giant with a wingspan approaching 11 meters, weighed an estimated 200 to 250 kilograms, despite being the size of a small aircraft, because almost nothing in its skeleton was solid. The German Solnhofen limestone beds, where Rhamphorhynchus fossils are found, preserve wing membranes in such detail that researchers can identify the fiber orientation within the membrane, showing it was stiffened by internal actinofibrils that gave the wing precise aerodynamic control rather than just a passive surface. What pterosaurs couldn't survive was the end Cretaceous extinction. Unlike the bird lineage, which had diversified sufficiently and was small enough to persist on reduced food supplies through the impact winter. Pterosaurs, already stressed by competition from early birds through the Cretaceous, had no surviving branch. The pterosaur branch left nothing behind. But the Jurassic world, for all the scale of its sauropods, all the precision of its marine predators, all the aerial dominance of its pterosaurs, was running on a plant system that had been in place since before the dinosaurs existed. Conifers, ferns, cycads, the same basic architecture, the same wind-dependent reproduction, the same slow spread across landscapes. In the early Cretaceous, something appeared in the fossil record so small and so fragmentary that it was easily missed. It would not stay small. What the angiosperms eventually did to the structure of life on land was more consequential than any extinction that preceded them, and the dinosaurs, for the most part, had no idea it was happening. The Cretaceous period began roughly 145 million years ago, and the world it opened on was still recognizably Jurassic in its broad outlines. Conifers dominated the forest canopy. Ferns covered the forest floor. Cycads stood in their stiff geometric arrangements along riverbanks and forest edges. The dinosaur faunas of the early Cretaceous still bore strong resemblances to their Jurassic predecessors. Sauropods still moved through the forests in large numbers, and the predator lineages that hunted them were still close relatives of Jurassic forms. But something was changing in the plant world, something small enough at first to be easily missed in the fossil record, something that would, over the course of the Cretaceous period, alter the entire structure of life on land more profoundly than any event since the colonization of the terrestrial surface by plants in the first place. Flowering plants, the angiosperms, appear in the early Cretaceous fossil record as isolated, fragmentary specimens, pollen grains in a matrix of conifer pollen, leaf impressions among the fern fronds, small flowers preserved in amber alongside insects that had been visiting them. At first, they were rare, confined to disturbed habitats along riverbanks and forest clearings where the established plant communities had been disrupted enough to allow new colonizers a foothold. But angiosperms had built into their biology a means of spreading that the older plant lineages had never developed, a relationship with the animal world that would, once it gained momentum, prove impossible for wind-dependent plants to compete with. The older forests didn't disappear immediately. They were simply outpaced, one habitat at a time, by something that had learned to use other living things as its engine. But the spread of flowering plants was not welcomed by the ecosystems it disrupted. The established plant communities of the Jurassic and early Cretaceous, the conifer forests, the fern meadows, the cycad groves, had been supporting dinosaur faunas for tens of millions of years, and those faunas were tuned to exploit them. Sauropods, with their peg-like teeth and long necks, were specifically suited to stripping conifer foliage from heights nothing else could reach. The digestive systems, the tooth morphology, the foraging behaviors of the dominant Jurassic herbivores had been refined over millions of years for a plant world that angiosperms were now displacing. As flowering plants spread through the Cretaceous, the herbivore lineages that had dominated the Jurassic found themselves increasingly mismatched to the food supply that was replacing the one they had been built for. Sauropod diversity declined through the Cretaceous in the northern hemisphere ecosystems, where angiosperm spread was fastest. The giants that had defined the Jurassic were being ecologically outpaced by a botanical revolution they had no mechanism to adapt to quickly enough. But the dinosaur lineages that could adapt did so with remarkable speed, and through the Middle and Late Cretaceous, new herbivore lineages expanded into the ecological space the angiosperms were creating. Animals shaped specifically for the new plant world rather than the old one, whose success was inseparable from the flowering plant revolution in ways that made them entirely dependent on it continuing. What the angiosperms built, these herbivores maintained. What these herbivores required, the angiosperms supplied. The dependency was mutual, invisible from inside it, and more fragile than either system could have revealed on its own. The Cretaceous transformation wasn't just botanical. Flowering plants rewired the entire terrestrial food web from the soil upward, and the consequences compounded at every level. Before angiosperms, land plant reproduction was slow and wind-dependent. Seeds spread where the wind carried them, which meant colonization of new ground was gradual and patchy. Flowering plants recruited animals, first insects, then larger vertebrates, as mobile reproductive agents, and in exchange they paid in sugar, protein, and fat. The fruit was the payment. Every dinosaur that ate a fruit and deposited the seed elsewhere, often miles from the parent plant, with a package of fertilizer, was doing the plant's work. This relationship drove flower evolution toward more attractive colors and scents, drove fruit evolution toward higher nutritional value, and drove animal evolution toward better color vision, more varied diets, and longer foraging ranges. Hadrosaurs with their dental batteries could process the tougher Cretaceous vegetation that older herbivore designs couldn't handle, which meant they could thrive in habitats that would have been marginal for Jurassic sauropods. Parasaurolophus crests, when modeled acoustically, produce resonant frequencies in the range that travels most efficiently through dense angiosperm forest, low, penetrating, distinct. These animals weren't just feeding in the new forests, they were communicating through them, using sound adapted to the specific acoustic properties of the habitat the flowering plant revolution had built. The Cretaceous world was more complex than the Jurassic, not because more time had passed, but because flowering plants had created new ecological architecture that didn't exist before. And every large herbivore alive in the late Cretaceous was a species that could only have existed inside it. But the Cretaceous world that the flowering plant revolution built needed predators capable of operating inside it. Animals large enough to take down the enormous new herbivore lineages that the angiosperms had made possible, sophisticated enough to find prey across the dense forest landscapes the new plant world had created. One lineage had been preparing for this role for 18 million years without knowing it. The tyrannosaurs began the Jurassic as unremarkable medium-sized theropods and ended the Cretaceous as something that had no precedent in land predator history. What that transformation actually produced, and what the fossil record says about how those animals actually lived, is more complicated than the popular image allows. The tyrannosaurs did not begin as giants. The earliest members of the lineage, appearing in the fossil record during the Middle Jurassic, roughly 165 million years ago, were modest-sized theropods, typically between 1 and 3 meters long, occupying the middle tiers of their ecosystems rather than the top. Guanlong, from the late Jurassic of what is now China, was a lightly built predator with an elaborate bony crest on its skull, more remarkable for its ornamentation than its size. Proceratosaurus, from roughly the same period in what is now England, was similarly unimposing. These were not apex predators. The top predator roles in Jurassic ecosystems were occupied by other theropod lineages. The allosaurids and their relatives and the early tyrannosaurs existed in the ecological space below them, hunting prey their larger competitors ignored or couldn't efficiently pursue. Through the early and middle Cretaceous, as the continents continued separating and the distribution of dinosaur lineages across the landmasses grew increasingly complex, the tyrannosaur lineage was evolving in the northern hemisphere ecosystems of what would eventually become North America and Asia. The Allosaurid lineage that had dominated Jurassic predator roles declined through the early Cretaceous, and as their dominance faded, the tyrannosaurs moved upward into the ecological space they vacated. The transformation was gradual by human timescales and rapid by geological ones. Over roughly 80 million years, the tyrannosaur body plan shifted from the light, long-armed, medium-sized predator of the Jurassic into something that had no precedent in the history of land predators. But the tyrannosaur's size created problems that its predecessors had never faced. An animal weighing 8 to 15 tons moves slowly relative to its potential prey, not because the legs are incapable of generating speed, but because the mechanical stress of rapid acceleration on bones and joints of that mass approaches the structural limits of biological materials. Fossil tyrannosaur leg bones show stress fractures and healed injuries at rates suggesting that high-speed pursuit was both possible and dangerous for the animal attempting it. A tyrannosaur that fractured a leg bone during a chase faced a recovery period of months, during which feeding would be severely compromised. And for an animal requiring thousands of calories a day just to maintain basic metabolic function, a prolonged reduction in hunting effectiveness could be fatal. The size that made T-Rex capable of killing the largest prey in its ecosystem also made T-Rex vulnerable to the consequences of the attempt. But the bone record raises another problem that the popular image of T-Rex doesn't account for. Tyrannosaur fossils carry a record of injuries that have nothing to do with prey. Damage consistent with encounters between tyrannosaurs themselves, healed in ways that indicate survival, repeated often enough to appear across multiple individuals in multiple fossil sites. What was happening between these animals? What social or territorial logic was producing these encounters? What the encounters meant for how tyrannosaurs organized their lives relative to each other? These are questions the fossil record poses without yet answering. The life of a tyrannosaur was not spent only hunting prey. A significant portion of that life was apparently spent navigating a relationship with others of its own kind, far more complicated than the solitary predator image allows. The tyrannosaur lineage spent over 80 million years arriving at T-Rex, and the final form is not an accident of scale. Every feature that looks extreme, the tiny arms, the massive skull, the forward-facing eyes, the enormous olfactory bulbs, is the endpoint of specific selection pressures operating across millions of generations in a specific ecological context. The arms shrank as the skull grew, because a skull large enough to generate the bite forces T-Rex needed required such a massive neck musculature that fall-in function was progressively crowded out. The skull itself, at nearly 1.5 meters long in large individuals and reinforced with internal struts of dense bone, could generate bite forces estimated at over 35,000 newtons, enough to shear through bone and extract the marrow within, which is a food source no other large predator in its ecosystem could access. T-Rex could eat parts of a carcass that Allosaurus couldn't. Its binocular field of view, wider than a modern hawk, and its olfactory processing, on par with a vulture, made it a sensory predator as much as a physical one. The fossil sites in Montana and Alberta, where multiple tyrannosaurs are found in close proximity, the Dry Island bone bed, the trackways in British Columbia suggest these weren't solitary animals moving alone through empty forest. They were tracking each other, possibly traveling together, possibly cooperating in ways the bone record alone can't resolve. Whether T. rex was truly social in the way wolves are social, or simply tolerant of others in the way some large predators are, the fossil record as it currently stands cannot say with certainty. What it can say is that the image of a lone animal with no awareness of others nearby is not supported by the evidence. But the giants were not the whole story. Through every era covered so far, through the Triassic recovery, the Jurassic zenith, the Cretaceous transformation, the rise of the tyrannosaurs, there was another world running in parallel, smaller and quieter, and almost entirely invisible in the popular image of the dinosaur era. The feathered theropods inching toward flight. The mammals were compressed into the hours of darkness by a world that had no room for them anywhere else. What those animals were accumulating across 165 million years in the shadows of the giants was not immediately useful. It would become the most consequential biological inheritance in the history of land vertebrates. Through all the eras covered so far in this story, through the Triassic recovery and the Jurassic zenith and the Cretaceous transformation, there was another world running alongside the one occupied by the giants. It was a world of small animals, insects threading through the forest understory, lizards hunting those insects along fallen logs, frogs calling from the margins of every Cretaceous pond and river, early snakes moving through the leaf litter in their legless, sinuous way. And among these small creatures, two groups were accumulating changes that would eventually matter enormously. The feathered theropods that were edging towards what we now call birds, and the small furry mammals that were learning, across millions of years of surviving in whatever spaces the dinosaurs left open, to become something the world had not yet seen. The feathered dinosaurs had been present since at least the late Jurassic. Archaeopteryx, found in the Solnhofen limestone beds of what is now Germany, is the most famous early example. A crow-sized animal with feathered wings, a wishbone, and the clawed hands and toothed jaw of its theropod ancestors, preserved in such detail that the outline of individual feathers is still visible against the fine-grained limestone. But Archaeopteryx was not the whole story, and for most of the 20th century, the full picture of feathered dinosaur diversity remained hidden, buried not in German limestone, but in the fine-grained volcanic ash deposits of northeastern China, in a region called Liaoning, where conditions had preserved not just bones, but the soft tissue structures surrounding them. But the small animals of the Cretaceous world faced pressures that the giants were largely insulated from. A tyrannosaur had no meaningful predators. A small feathered theropod had dozens, larger dinosaurs, crocodilians, early birds, snakes, and other small theropods, all competing for the same prey, and sometimes preying on each other. Living small in the Cretaceous world meant living inside a predation pressure that selected intensely for alertness, speed, and the ability to exploit microhabitats that larger animals couldn't access. The undergrowth was not a refuge. It was a different kind of danger, one measured in seconds rather than in tons. The small creatures that survived in it did so because their sensory systems, their reproductive rates, and their behavioral flexibility were being continuously sharpened by a level of mortality that the large dinosaurs never experienced. But the mammals faced an additional constraint that the feathered theropods did not. The daylight hours, the most productive foraging window, the hours when visibility was highest and temperature most favorable, belonged to the dinosaurs. Mammals that ventured into the open during the day faced predation in a sensory environment where they were consistently outmatched. The mammals that survived were the ones pushed into the hours and the spaces the dinosaurs left unclaimed, shaped by a constraint that was never chosen and never relaxed. Accumulating adaptations imposed by the specific conditions of survival in a world that didn't have room for them anywhere else. That this constraint would eventually matter more than any advantage the large dinosaurs possessed was not something any animal in the Cretaceous world could have known. The Yishian Formation discoveries didn't just add feathers to a few dinosaur species, they retroactively changed what every large Cretaceous theropod probably looked like. Sinosauropteryx's filamentous feathers preserved the melanosomes, the pigment-producing structures, in enough detail that scientists could determine the animal was reddish-brown on its upper surface with a striped tail. Anchiornis was reconstructed in specific color: black and white body feathers, reddish-orange head crest, white wing feathers with black tips. These are not approximations. They are chemical readings from the fossil itself, converted into color through comparison with the melanosomes of living bird feathers. What this means for the larger tyrannosaurs, which descended from feathered ancestors and whose early relatives were demonstrably feathered, is still debated. But the probability that juvenile tyrannosaurs were covered in insulating filaments is now taken seriously by most researchers who study them. The small mammals moving through the undergrowth of this same Cretaceous world were not passive bystanders. Rhipenomyrmus robustus, at roughly a meter long, had the bones of a juvenile Psittacosaurus in its stomach, a dinosaur it had killed or scavenged and eaten. Mammals were not simply hiding from dinosaurs. Some were predating them, and in their accumulating brain complexity, their increasingly precise teeth, their diversifying reproductive strategies, they were assembling the exact set of tools that would determine which animals inherited the planet when the dinosaurs' dominance collapsed. Tools built across 165 million years of living in the margins, refined generation by generation, ready before the opportunity to use them arrived. But the world the dinosaurs had built across 165 million years was, by the late Cretaceous, the most ecologically complex terrestrial system the planet had ever produced. The hadrosaur herds, the tyrannosaurs, the ceratopsians, the ankylosaurs, the full expression of everything the dinosaur lineage had been building toward since the first small archosaurs tested their upright stance in the wreckage of the Permian world. What ended it was not a failure of the system. It was something that arrived from outside the atmosphere entirely, on a specific day, in a specific place, and made every other stress the late Cretaceous world was carrying suddenly irrelevant. The late Cretaceous world, 66 million years ago, was the most ecologically elaborate terrestrial system the planet had ever produced. The western interior of North America, a region of coastal forests, floodplains, and river deltas lying along the shores of a shallow inland sea that split the continent from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic, supported a dinosaur community of extraordinary complexity. Hadrosaur herds moved through the coastal forests in numbers that left bone beds stretching for kilometers. Individuals dying and accumulating across decades until the sheer density of their remains created geological features visible today in formations like the Horseshoe Canyon in Alberta. Ceratopsians, the horned and frilled dinosaurs with Triceratops as the most familiar, grazed the coastal plains in groups whose size we can only estimate from the trackway evidence they left behind. Ankylosaurs moved through the undergrowth, their armored backs and tail clubs making them effectively immune to most predation. Above all of this, pterosaurs still soared. But the world supporting all of this was under pressure. Volcanic systems on the far side of the planet had been erupting in sustained pulses for the last million years of the Cretaceous, releasing enough gas into the atmosphere to shift the global climate measurably. Sea levels were falling as the great shallow inland seas began withdrawing from the continental interiors, rearranging the geography that dinosaur communities had organized themselves around for millions of years. Whether those communities were already thinning under the accumulated weight of these changes, or whether they remained as dense and complex as the fossil record suggests, right up to the final day, is something paleontologists still argue about. What is not argued is what came next. But the impact itself was only the beginning of the mechanism that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. The fireball, the tsunami, the earthquake. These were local and regional in their effects, catastrophic for everything within thousands of kilometers of the impact site, but not, by themselves, sufficient to cause a global extinction of animals as widespread and numerous as the late Cretaceous dinosaurs. What followed was more lethal and more total than the impact moment itself, a disruption to the planetary systems that regulate temperature, light, and biological productivity so fundamental that the surface of the Earth became, within weeks, a place operating by different rules than the ones every living thing had been built for. The energy that had sustained every food web on the planet was interrupted at its source, and the consequences of that interruption moved through every ecosystem on Earth with a speed and completeness that no prior extinction had approached. But the collapse was not instantaneous, and that matters for understanding what survived. Animals with lower metabolic demands could persist longer on whatever remained in a dying landscape. Animals whose requirements were modest enough to be met by what persisted even in the absence of living plant communities had a path through the darkness that larger animals did not. The darkness lasted long enough to destroy any animal dependent on the high productivity ecosystems of the late Cretaceous, but not long enough to eliminate every organism capable of surviving on less. The survivors weren't chosen by any logic of fitness in the pre-impact world. They were chosen by the specific, narrow requirements of survival in conditions that had never existed before. And the characteristics that had made large dinosaurs successful for one, the Chicxulub impactor, roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across, hit the shallow waters off the Yucatan Peninsula with a force estimated at 1 billion times the energy of the Hiroshima bomb. The immediate effects were catastrophic: a fireball, a mega tsunami, an earthquake registering magnitude 11 or higher across the entire planet. But the extinction mechanism that killed the non-avian dinosaurs wasn't the impact itself, it was the impact winter that followed, as pulverized rock dust and soot from global fires blocked sunlight for months to years, collapsing photosynthesis, collapsing the plant-based food webs that every large land animal depended on. Animals that could survive on seeds, insects, detritus, the resources that persisted even without living plants, had a path through. Animals that required large quantities of living vegetation every day did not. The bird lineage, already diverse and small-bodied, had members that could eat seeds and insects through the darkness, and those members survived. The 10,000 bird species alive today carry a combined biomass greater than all wild mammals on Earth, and every one of them is a direct continuation of the theropod lineage that first appeared in the Triassic. The conifer forests carpeting the northern hemisphere trace their lineages to Triassic and Jurassic radiations, the flowering plants that now make up roughly 90% of all plant species on Earth. The crops, the fruits, the flowers evolved during the dinosaur era, shaped by co-evolutionary relationships with the animals that ate and dispersed them. The dinosaur lineage has been present on this planet for 234 million years without interruption. It did not end at the Cretaceous boundary. It passed through it in the bodies of small feathered theropods, the same lineage that had produced Allosaurus and Spinosaurus and Tyrannosaurus, carrying that genetic continuity through the impact winter and into every ecosystem on Earth that exists today. If this journey through 165 million years was worth your night, a like helps more people find it. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one.